Axis and Allies is a series of World War II strategy board games. Originally designed by Larry Harris and published by Nova Game Designs in 1981, the game was republished by the Milton Bradley Company in 1984 as part of the Gamemaster series of board games. This edition has been retroactively named Axis and Allies Classic to differentiate it from later revisions. In 1996, Axis and Allies Classic was inducted into the Academy of Adventure Gaming Arts and Design Adventure Gaming Hall of Fame. Games magazine also has inducted Axis and Allies into the Buyer's Guide Hall of Fame, an honor the magazine extends to games that have met or exceeded the highest standards of quality and play value and have been continuously in production for at least 10 years, i.e., classics. Axis and Allies Classic was the most successful of the 5 Gamemaster series of board games. Long after the Gamemaster name was retired, A&A Classic lives on, having been moved to the Avalon Hill lineup following the acquisition of Milton Bradley Company and Avalon Hill by Hasbro. The game itself has gone through several revisions, most recently in 2013. The object of the game and its spin-offs is to win the war by capturing enough critical territories to gain the advantage over the enemy in a recreation of World War II. After acquiring Milton Bradley and Avalon Hill, Hasbro transferred the Axis and Allies Classic board game from the Milton Bradley division to the Avalon Hill division in 1999. In 1999, Hasbro acquired Wizards of the Coast. In 2004, Hasbro made Avalon Hill a subsidiary of Wizards of the Coast. The Axis and Allies board game series is currently produced by WOTC under the Avalon Hill label. Hasbro is the parent company. There are a total of 11 board games in the Axis and Allies series, 8 of which are currently available from many game resellers. The 2 out-of-print A&A board games, Axis and Allies Classic and Axis and Allies 50th Anniversary Edition, can be found on various auction websites. The original Axis and Allies Classic board game has been followed by 10 spin-off games using more or less the same mechanics. In 1999, Axis and Allies Europe was released, with slightly updated rules and focus on the European theatre of World War II. This was followed in 2001 by Axis and Allies Pacific, with similar rules and focus shifted to the Pacific theatre. Axis and Allies D-Day focused on the Allied liberation of France. In 2004, the first major revision to the core game, Axis and Allies Revised, was released, with elements taken from A&A Europe and A&A Pacific, also celebrating the 20th anniversary of Axis and Allies itself. Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge focused on the Battle of the Bulge in Europe, while Axis and Allies Guadalcanal focused on the Solomon Islands campaign in the Pacific. In 2008, Axis and Allies 50th Anniversary Edition was released as one of the 3 games celebrating the 50th anniversary of its publisher, Avalon Hill. This was followed by Axis and Allies 1942 in 2009, the second major revision to the core game, with mechanics taken from the Anniversary Edition, also celebrating the 25th anniversary of Axis and Allies itself. Axis and Allies Pacific 1940 was released in December 2009, and Axis and Allies Europe 1940 was released in the second half of 2010. The 11th A&A board game in the series, Axis and Allies Europe 1940 was released in August 2010. The game can be combined with Pacific 1940 to form a global game of World War II on a combined 175 x 80 cm map. All 9 major powers of World War II, China, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States and the Anzac forces, are represented in the combined global game with unique units and colors. To streamline the game and correct balance issues, Global 1940 was revised and a new rule set was released on the Axis and Allies forums in January 2011. Axis and Allies is not a strict historical wargame, due to its streamlining for ease of play and balancing so that both sides have a chance to win. For instance, the economic model is simplistic, with each territory producing a number of industrial production certificates for the purchase of new units. Moreover, the game is supposed to start in the spring of 1942, but Japan is immediately in position to attack Hawaii again, while Germany is pressed well into the Soviet Union with an initially superior force. If the game were truer to history, the Axis empires would be at their climax in 1942, about to be pushed back by the Allies. Gameplay. In every edition of Axis and Allies, players play as the major belligerents of World War II. Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The A&A 50th Anniversary Edition also includes Italy as the third Axis power and China as the fourth Allied power. The A&A Pacific 1940 Edition includes China and Anzac. The A&A Europe 1940 Edition includes Italy and France. The players playing the Axis powers team up against those of the Allied powers in an attempt to conquer key territories, represented by regions on the map board. In earlier editions, this was done by capturing and holding until the end of a round of play certain territories where the opposing alliance's capital cities are located. In later editions, this also included other territories on the map, where victory cities are located. In the original Milton Bradley edition, A&A Classic, the Axis powers could also win by capturing and holding until the end of a round of play enough territories to gain an economic advantage. This economic victory was dropped in later editions of A&A. Each round of a game involves each of the powers moving in turn according to a specified order. The game ends when either the Axis powers or the Allied powers complete their objectives. When each power takes its turn, they must first declare how they are to spend the IPCs in their possession. This may go into buying new units, improving units through research, or repairing damaged structures. Players then declare any movements made that would result in combat, moving their pieces as appropriate, and after resolving combat, declaring any non-combat movements. At the end of the turn, players then place any units that were purchased at the beginning of the turn and collect IPCs based on all territories that they control at the end of their turn. Combat is typically divided into several types. In all types, however, combat is divided into rounds. In each round, attackers and defenders roll dice to determine which of their units deal hits on the opposing side. If the number rolled is less than or equal to the unit's attack or defense rating, the unit scores a hit on an opposing unit of the opponent's choosing. During the round, if an attacker defeats an enemy, the enemy can do a final retaliation before death, then be taken off the board. Some types of combat, such as strategic bombing raids, naval bombardment, and anti-aircraft defense, last only one round, though in others the attacker has the option of either continuing with another round of battle or retreating. Combat is fully resolved when either side loses all their units or the attackers choose to retreat, though combat in different territories may be resolved in any order of the attacker's choosing. Combat in one territory may affect the number of combatants in another territory for later battles, as in the case of an amphibious assault or when attacking units withdraw. Units. Revisions. Revisions would follow shortly after the game release, as the rules didn't always produce results which made sense in the context of the historical setting. This was later revised so that all aircraft could attack submarines. Although not the very first edition, the Milton Bradley release was the first to establish the well-known game mechanics. There were 3 versions of the rules for the Milton Bradley games, though only the first 2 were included with the game itself. The third edition rules were exclusive to a computer video game of Axis and Allies by Hasbro, released in 1998, and Axis and Allies Iron Blitz with minor additional rules, released in 1999. The three editions differed by minor details. There is also a newer video game of Axis and Allies RTS, released in 2004, a departure from the original A&A classic world map and introducing several tactical battle scenarios. The Axis and Allies RTS was followed by Axis and Allies RTS Collector's Edition with expanded strategy guide included. The first major revision to the rules was designed by Larry Harris and Mike Selinka, who tried to address many of the Milton Bradley version's shortcomings, including removing the Axis economic victory condition and the requirement of capturing enemy capitals in favor of victory cities, which has been used in every revision since. With victory cities, the Axis and Allies start with an equal number of victory cities, and strive to capture enough victory cities to gain a majority of them. This allows players to play shorter or longer games, depending upon the number of victory cities a power must control in order to claim victory. With each revision, there were also balance changes in order to make gameplay more dynamic. In the Milton Bradley edition, infantry were cheap units that tended to be most useful as defensive cannon fodder, due to their token attack and slightly better defense. This had led to many areas of the game board being heavily fortified, bogging gameplay down to a matter of who could build more infantry faster. To counteract this, the tank, whose defensibility was equal to infantry in the Milton Bradley release, had its defensive capabilities improved in the revised edition, so as to encourage players to use combined arms. Other balance changes included altering the costs of the various units, and altering the transport capacity. In the Milton Bradley edition, transports could carry only 2 infantry or 1 of any other land unit. Later revisions had transports able to carry 1 infantry in addition to 1 of any other land unit. The variety of land and sea units was increased by introducing artillery and destroyers from A&A Europe and A&A Pacific to A&A Revised Edition. Artillery increased the effectiveness of infantry in attacks, while destroyers limited the usefulness of submarines and acted as a lower-cost substitute for the expensive battleship. Cruisers were introduced in A&A 50th Anniversary Edition to effectively split the destroyer's many abilities. While destroyers continue to limit the usefulness of submarines, the stronger cruisers now act as lower-cost battleships. The game board itself was also reworked in each revision. The Milton Bradley Classic release featured largely vibrant colors, while the revised version featured mainly darker tones. The 50th Anniversary Edition and 1942 edition has a more realistic terrain with only subtle hints of color to denote which power has initial control over a particular territory. The composition of territories was also slightly altered. For example, the number of territories between Berlin and Moscow had been increased for the revised edition, including adding many Soviet territories of strategic importance. Strategic bombing was altered over the years. Until the revised edition, strategic bombing caused opposing players to lose the IPCs they had on hand. The 50th Anniversary Edition changed this so that industrial complexes were damaged instead. Damaged industrial complexes had less capacity to produce units and can be repaired at the cost of IPCs. Later revisions have also included changes in research to have more of an effect, with mixed results. 1942 edition eliminates research altogether. Another feature that was implemented but was later dropped was the revised edition's national advantages, which represented tactics and technologies used by a specific power during the war. For example, a British ability allowed the British player to delay their combat movement until the American player's turn once per game, in order to have a coordinated attack. Later editions had minor cosmetic changes in the playing pieces. In the Milton Bradley version, only the infantry pieces were unique to each power in appearance. Unique units was later expanded to include nearly every unit in later editions. Compared to the generic fighters of the Milton Bradley release, the Supermarine Spitfire was used in later editions to represent British fighters. The A6M0 was used to represent Japanese fighters, while two different fighters represented American fighters. The color scheme to associate units with powers was also standardized across all Axis and Allies series games based on the colors used in A&A Europe and A&A Pacific, and is different from those used in the Milton Bradley release. In 2009, an updated version of Axis and Allies Pacific was released, entitled Axis and Allies Pacific 1940. The 10th board game in the A&A series, A&AP 1940, introduced the Anzac forces as a playable power, along with two new unit types, mechanized infantry and tactical bombers. In 2010, an updated version of Axis and Allies Europe was released, entitled Axis and Allies Europe 1940. A&AE 1940 introduced France as a playable power. Mechanized infantry and tactical bomber units continue to appear after debuting in A&A Pack 40. Italy also appears as a playable power in A&AE 1940 after debuting in A&A 50. In A&AE 1940 and A&AP 1940, aircraft carriers and battleships of capital ships that are damaged with one hit and sunk with two hits. Damaged CVs and BBs can be repaired by moving the damaged CV or BB to a friendly naval base for repairs. Special rules apply for fighters and tactical bombers if a CV is damaged. A&AE 1940 is the 11th A&A board game in the series. A&AE 1940 and A&AP 1940 are designed to be played as separate games or may be combined into one game to create a 2 to 6 player global 1940 scenario, complete with separate setup and national objectives. The combined A&AE 1940 and A&AP 1940 maps measure 175 x 80 centimeters. All 9 major powers of World War II are represented with unique unit pieces and their own unique color. Spin-offs. Due to the success of Axis and Allies Classic, as of 2010, there are now 10 spin-off games in the A&A franchise. 3 are updated or expanded versions of the original global A&A Classic game. An additional 4 games are theater games depicting Europe or the Pacific. An additional 3 games are local games of specific battles. Axis and Allies Revised. Axis and Allies 1942. Axis and Allies 50th Anniversary Edition. Axis and Allies Pacific. Axis and Allies Europe. Axis and Allies Pacific 1940. Axis and Allies Europe 1940. Axis and Allies D-Day. Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge. Axis and Allies Guadalcanal. Additional games have also been published by other game designers with similar mechanics. Board games. In addition to designing the board games, Larry Harris had also designed A&A Europe and A&A Pacific, which had the core mechanics of Axis and Allies adapted for a specific theater. This, in turn, served as the catalyst for the revised edition. Although there were preliminary plans for a variant that allowed players to combine Europe and Pacific together, it had never been published. Larry Harris has announced 2 completely new editions. Axis and Allies Pacific 1940 to be released in December 2009 and Axis and Allies Europe 1940 to be released in summer 2010, which will also include a variant that combines both games together. Other Harris-designed Axis and Allies games were more tactical in nature, and focused on individual battles. Axis and Allies D-Day focused on the Allied liberation of France. Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge focused on the Battle of the Bulge, while Axis and Allies Guadalcanal focused on the Solomon Islands campaign. Though these games retained many of the traditional mechanics, some were specific to the particular game. Video games. There have been two Axis and Allies video game versions released, each of which had an updated version release. Axis and Allies released in 1998 and Axis and Allies Iron Blitz with minor additional rules released in 1999. A&A. Iron Blitz has Marines, paratroopers, destroyers and kamikazes. There is also a newer video game of Axis and Allies RTS released in 2004 and an expanded version, Axis and Allies RTS Collector's Edition, was released in 2006. The two RTS games are a departure from the original A&A Classic World Map and introduce several tactical battlefield scenarios. The A&A video games are known to have some bugs. There are A&A video game patches available on various A&A websites. In 2008, Wizards of the Coast created an online version of Axis and Allies as part of their GleeMax game site. When GleeMax was cancelled, the game found its way to the GameTable online game site, who programmed the game for Wizards of the Coast. The initial version was based on the 2004 revised edition. In September 2010, GameTable Online has developed a new version based on the Axis and Allies 1942 set. Also available is Triply, an open-source adaptation of Axis and Allies made using Java, requiring Java 1.5 or higher. It is available for Windows, Mac, and Linux operating systems. It allows users to play single-player against an AI, or hot seat against other friends in the same room. It allows multiplayer on an online lobby, and also over email and network connections. Originally released in 2002, it has been steadily improving and is now on stable version 1.3.2.2, which is able to play the major versions of Axis and Allies: Classic, Revised, 50th Anniversary Edition, and Spring 1942. It also hosts many fan-created maps, which have similar rules to Axis and Allies, but use a different setup or a different map or era altogether. Miniature games. In 2005, Axis and Allies Miniatures was released as the series' first foray into miniature gaming. This was followed up by Axis and Allies Naval Miniatures. War at Sea, with Axis and Allies Air Force Miniatures. Angels 20 being released in October 2011. There have been several additional A&A Miniatures booster releases. Currently there are 20 countries represented in A&A Miniatures.